Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up and a fairly eclectic wrap-up of some of my recent reading. First up, I read Mahmoud Darwish's A River Dies of Thirst. This was translated from the Arabic by Catherine Cobham, who is not the same translator that I have read of his other work. So this is a more random collection than a lot of the other collections of his work that I've read, because this was his last published piece. It came out the same year he died, in 2008. And it's a bit more eclectic. There are some pieces that are poetry, there are some pieces that are essays, there are some pieces that feel almost like journal entries. So it is interesting in the sense that you're getting an overview of writing that he did near the end of his life, but it is, I would say, not as cohesive as In the Presence of Absence, for example. And, having read the book that he wrote as a self-elegy, going and reading this, which is technically his actual last work, but doesn't feel a conscious work of summation of his life, it feels a little bit unsatisfying that way. Again, it's hard to talk about the style because this is a different translator, and so you are getting it filtered through someone else's word choices, so it's hard to discuss like that because I don't know if I would say that this feels less engaging, or if it's just that I don't enjoy Catherine Cobham's translation as much as I enjoyed Sinan Antoon's translation. So, I don't know. But while I'm talking about translations, I'm going to mention two other things that I don't think were particularly well translated. First up is one where I 100% know the translation was bad. This is The Glass Palace, which is a collection of 4 short stories by Sabahattin Ali of Madonna in a Fur Coat is his most famous one. He was an early 20th century Turkish writer who was probably assassinated when he was 40. His life is fascinating. This book has a translator named, but it clearly was barely edited from an auto translation. And you can tell because some of the word order comes through, literally. And some of the pronouns are inconsistent in a way that wouldn't happen if an actual person was doing the translating. Because, so there is a female character at one point, and she's she sometimes and it sometimes, which happens in auto translations because Turkish only has one pronoun, o, and it's he, she, and it. So an auto translator won't know which one to do that. A human would know. And so that comes through in that book suggests to me that the person who's listed as the translator, they did not actually do any translation. So it's not worth talking about because it is genuinely unreadable. It's kind of interesting as an exercise in how badly a translation can be done. But yeah, it was like shockingly bad because you just can't, mind-blowingly bad. And that's not self-published. That's from an actual publisher. I do not understand that. I had similar feelings about this book, The Moment, by Nura Bazdulj-Hubijar. This is, again, there's a translator listed for a couple of the stories. This is a collection of short stories, and 2 of which have a translator named, but the rest of which are named to the team. And some of the language choices are so odd here that it feels like it was probably a translation issue. Now, this is translated from the Balkan language, which I am not familiar enough personally to know how much of that might be an artistic choice and how much might be a translation choice, but it feels like the kind of thing that is a weird translation choice. So, yeah, it's challenging to talk about it then. So the first story in here, Memento Mori, which is a war story, I like a war story. I enjoyed that one the most. The rest of these were okay. But I kept coming back to this odd language choice. And because there seem to be 2 translators working on this, and this is a book that also has weird printing choices. The margins are enormous and there are print issues. So I do wonder if they cheaped out on the translation piece. So again, this is a book that I don't know how to talk about but I'm not just going to complain about translation choices here. I'm going to talk about some good stuff too. Next up, I have Jamilia by Chingiz Aitmatov. This is a book that was written in the 1950s, but is set in the 1940s. And it was translated by James Riordan in 2007. This is set in Kyrgyzstan during the Second World War. We follow the character that we're in the mind of is a young teenager, and most of the older teenagers and the men have gone to war. He is working with his sister-in-law, who's the title character, doing agricultural work, And along with joining them is then this wounded veteran who comes in. The way this is blurbed, it presents it as being this love story between the sister-in-law and the wounded soldier. But what it really is a love story about is the land, and you feel just the Central Asian landscape rolling out, and the way people talk about the community and the hills and the steppe and whatnot. That seems to be the real love story that's happening. Because we're staying in the mind of this 15-year-old boy, we don't really have an insight into the title character or this wounded soldier that sings, other than bits and pieces. Like, we know that the sister-in-law may have married the brother because he impressed her when he won a contest, or it may have been a bride kidnapping. The 15-year-old is uncertain about that because the family doesn't really know. So there's a lot of really interesting background stuff there. This was just fantastic. I really enjoyed this. This was a book that I planned to read the first chapter and ended up reading it straight through because it was that fantastic. It's not particularly long, but yeah, top-notch, fantastic flow and kind of a peek into a moment in time and a moment in people's lives in a way that I thought was really successful and nicely done, but don't expect an actual romantic love story because that is not really what's going on there. Next up, another book that I loved, and this is Faruk Šehić's Under Pressure. This is a series of short stories all set during the war in Bosnia in the 90s, but most of them are dealing with an insurrection, so it's sort of a war within the war, and it expresses a kind of frustration. I've seen this described as a fragmentary novel as opposed to short stories, and that works too, because it does feel very fragmentary. You get bits and pieces, and it's almost sharply written. This was translated by Mirza Purić, who does make the choice that I think not everyone loves, in that he translates dialect into dialect. So there are bits that were clearly originally written in some kind of specific dialect, and it's translated into a very English style. So I saw Daniel from Guilty Feet did a discussion about this a while ago, which I'll link to. He mentioned reading a book that was translated from Spanish that was Cuban, and that he felt it took him out of the story to have particularly English terminology in it. So if you're bothered by that kind of thing, there is that in here. I personally thought it worked because I don't think you can convey the fact that people are speaking in dialect without choosing a dialect on your own, and that's just how that works. So that worked for me, but your mileage may vary on that kind of thing. I did think this was fantastic, though. There's a recurring theme where whether you're following a single main character or more than one is a little vague. It feels in a couple of points like we have people of a couple of different ages, so it may be more than one person, but whether it's one or several, there are multiple points in here where we get a narrator who is talking about shrapnel and shrapnel collections or meditating on shrapnel, and I think that adds to the whole sharp and fragmentary motif that's going on in here. Anyway, I thought this was fantastic, and I think this is probably more accessible than Šehić's novel Quiet Flows the Una, which I raved about earlier this year. That is probably still my favorite book that I read this year, and definitely favorite novel, but this is top-notch as well. And if you are looking for something that's a little more accessible and straightforward, yeah, this is that. And because I don't only read depressing translated fiction, I also read a few graphic novels, one of which was volume 3 in Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips's Reckless series. Brubaker and Phillips write a lot of neo-noir and neo-pulp crime fiction. This is one that's set in the 1980s, so it doesn't have that gritty 70s or 30s, 40s feel to it that a lot of their books have. And I go back and forth about whether I love this or not, because they're creators who I enjoy everything they write. Default is, this is a good book. Is it going to be a great book? And I kind of feel like it doesn't quite hit the great mark, but I never know if I'm being unfair with them because I do think they're such a brilliant creative team when it comes to this style of book. So in this, the main character, who is a private investigator of sorts or a fixer of sorts, and his co-worker, who's sort of his secretary and sort of runs the movie theater that he owns, they have a bit of a falling out, which leads to drama ensues. It does what it does well enough. I do feel, as I said with the first 2 books in the series, I feel like this needed to be slightly longer than it is. They are cranking these things out, and I've been impressed at how, and there is going to be another one coming out in the spring, so the turnaround on these is impressive, considering that they normally put at least a year between each, and it's been a year and a half, and we've had 3 books, and we're going to have a 4th soon. That's fun, and it does make it feel a little bit more like a traditional serial, which goes in with the neo-pulp kind of thing. So yeah, if you enjoy this kind of thing and you want to see one that's set in the 80s in California, here you go. This is that book. It is good. Maybe not as great as I tend to expect when I'm reading these guys, though. So I also read 2 kind of light humor comic strip collections, and that was It Can Be Arranged and Yes, I'm Hot in This by Huda, who has a new book coming out, and I've seen a bunch of people reading advanced copies of that, which is why I picked these 2 things up. She has an art style that I would say is the very simple kind of late 2000s blog style. If you know, say, Michi Ng's comic essays or Ali Brosh's comic essays, it is that similar, very simple, you drew this in paint type style. But she uses the 4-panel plus a punchline style that you see in, say, Sarah Anderson or Debbie Tung's work. So if you are a fan of that style and that format, this is that kind of thing. She is mostly talking about her life. She's from Dearborn and lives in Houston, and gets a lot of weirdness just from the general public as a hijabi woman. And so a lot of this is jokes about people being ignorant. Some of it's just jokes about life, and the It Can Be Arranged is jokes about how she met her husband at a religious conference. It's fine. As with all of these light things, I think if you are into that light humor, these are top-notch. If you are like me and you want your humor to be really lowbrow or really highbrow and not this in-between thing, it's not exactly my thing, but they're kind of a fun way to spend some time, so they were okay for me, but they might be top-notch for you, depending on your sense of humor. Since humor is super subjective, hopefully I will have inserted some photos of the art here so you can get an idea of it. So that has been some of the things I've been reading lately. I guess the next wrap-up is going to be nonfiction November-y stuff, so there we go. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought, and yep, that's it for now. Ciao.